Hi guys, I'm trying this out for the first time. So we're going to take a look at the Restoration and 18th century England. We just finished Macbeth, and now we're moving on to the next time period. What my expectation is, you'll be taking some of your own notes because you will take a quiz using an online assessment tool on the introduction information for the Restoration and 18th century England. So this time period goes from 1660 until 1798. So we're starting at 1660, we're headed forward to 1798. So if you're wondering when does it take place, now you know. So to get started, we always start with the monarchs. So that's what we'll do first. In 1660, King Charles II had been in exile in outside of the country. He had left the country. He had gone to France. He was hiding because the Puritans wanted total control of England. So they kind of chased him out. And then the Puritans, they were a minority group. They were fighting. There was a civil war in England. And finally, in 1660, the Puritan group fail. They're unable to take control of the government. And King Charles is brought back. That's why they call it the Restoration, because he was restored to the throne. So after the failed attempt for the Puritans to take over the country, King Charles II is brought back. So what happens then, after he comes back, that things are still a little bit unstable in the country. We have a line of monarchs that rule for kind of a short period of time. James II, he's Charles's brother, so that's the relationship there. He takes over. He doesn't rule for very long, only 3 years, because he brought the Catholic Church back into power in Europe, and people did not want that. Remember, the Catholic Church used to be the reigning power in Europe, and it was corrupt. So he's thrown out. Then we get James's daughter. So James is Charles's brother. Then we get James's daughter, Queen Mary, and she's married to William of Orange, and he's Dutch, so he's from the Netherlands. And the two of them rule for 12 years, so not very long. And then we move on to Queen Anne. Anne is Mary's sister. She rules again for about another 12 years, doesn't have any children. And then over time, we get George I. George I comes to power in 1714. And James comes, let me start over. George is brought from outside of this family, and George I is a decent king, I guess. He rules from 1714 to 1727. And then we get George II. Both of these Georges don't know how to speak English very well because they had German background, so they really didn't speak English very well. They weren't very effective monarchs. Later, we get a King George III. So King George I, King George II, mediocre rulers, didn't speak English very well. King George III reigns for 60 years, and he's very good at what he does. So finally, when King George III comes along, and I don't have him listed on the slide, but he's the one who kind of creates the best atmosphere in the Restoration. He rules for 60 years. Moving on. So, English Parliament. The monarchs have less power now, and Parliament is kind of like our Congress. We get a two-party system that starts to have some power in the government. So it isn't just a king saying this is what it's going to be. We actually have a parliament where you have representatives. Now, of course, the representatives could only be male. They could only be landowners. They could only be white. So we have a lot of restrictions, but the Tories, as you can see on the slide, are representing the upper class, the wealthy. The Whigs are representing the working class. So they are paying attention to the people who are working. And these are the two parties in Parliament representing the people. So this is what's happening in government. It's kind of becoming a little more modern during this time. The king has less power. Also, during the Great Restoration, something that causes some upheaval, besides the constant revolving door of kings and queens, there were two great disasters in England. In 1665, they had the plague. The plague, you've heard about it before, but this plague in London killed many, many people. And then you have the Great Fire in 1606, and that pretty much burns down the city. So it had to be rebuilt, and London, it's quite disastrous. I mean, when you think about the plague, think like what we're dealing with right now, COVID-19, without social distancing, without modern healthcare. So a lot of people were dying in England. So we have a lot of monarchs. We have two great disasters. And then we also have urban sprawl. And if you know, you probably heard the phrase urban sprawl before. Urban sprawl is when we have lots of people flocking to the city. They want to go live in the city. They're moving from the country. There isn't enough housing for them. There isn't enough water for them. And we know London is growing very fast. So Daniel Defoe makes this observation. He says there are 7 English groups, 7 economical groups or socioeconomic groups. And he breaks them up this way. He says there are the great. These people live profusely. They have way too much of everything, fancy everything. They wear powdered wigs. They have more food than they need. Then you have the rich. They live plentifully. They have enough. Maybe they don't have 12 powdered wigs. They might have 1. But they have some servants, probably. They own maybe some land, not acres and acres of land like the great would. But then you have the middle sort, and they live well, comfortably, aren't wanting for things, have food. The working trades, they work hard. These people have to work hard. They labor hard, but they feel no want. So they always have enough of everything. The country people only do well when crops do well, when the weather is good, certain seasons of the year. So they are dependent on nature and what's happening in nature. And then you have the poor, and the poor fare hard. They don't, probably won't live as long. And then the miserable, and the way Defoe describes this, he says they really pinch and suffer want. They're starving, they're sick, they don't have a place to sleep. And those are the 7 groups in England at this time. I am going to pause this for a second because I want to make sure it's working. I will be back in a moment. Okay, picking up where we left off. So, education in England at this time. Universal education was not offered, which meant a lot of people were illiterate. Probably 3/4 of the population was illiterate, couldn't read, was not allowed the opportunity to go to school. We have 2 universities, though, in England at this time. There's a picture there of Oxford, and then we have Cambridge. So both of those are where people can get secondary education. Of course, you would have to be a white male of the upper class to attend. Marriage in England at this time. So marriage was an economic arrangement. People didn't marry because they were in love. You married to unite an estate. You married to kind of as a transaction. So not a lot of happy romance marriage stories. This was also coined the Restoration was, also coined the Age of Elegance, because the upper class, the very wealthy people, lived so elaborately. You can see a picture there in the bottom corner. They lived, the men wore wigs. The men's wigs had to be curled every day. The men wore silk stockings, satin coats. The women would have powdered hair, large hoop skirts. They just lived in such a way that we would think was ostentatious, but way over the top. Life in London at this time. So one of the social centers for the middle class were the coffee houses in London. People would gather there, financiers, merchants, ship owners. They would gather there. It was a place where the middle class kind of found a way of belonging. The Age of Reason in London, this is also coined the Age of Reason because you have Sir Isaac Newton looking at the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. So now we have like books where we're looking at math in new ways. We have people who their whole job is looking at math and philosophy. So the Age of Reason, they're kind of opening doors to intelligence that had not been seen before in the world. So literature, this is kind of our baseline, right? This is where we get to the most important thing. Literature in Restoration England. Drama, we already had drama during the Renaissance. Now drama has changed and it is primarily only for the upper class. We do have women, acting in theaters at this time, but it's not something that the common people can go to anymore. Lyric poems are kind of a big deal during this time period. They died off a little bit before, and then they come back. They're revived with William Blake. The authors that we will be studying from the Restoration will be Daniel Defoe, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Johnson, and William Blake, who's one of my favorites. So looking at this is your preview to the Restoration period. I'm going to end with that for today, and we'll get into the next section later. Thank you.